Hello, I'm Helio Fred Garcia, an adjunct associate professor in the Professional Development and Leadership program at Columbia Engineering. I teach the required course in ethics and integrity. I also teach electives in crisis management for engineers and leadership communication for engineers, as well as an advanced ethics elective. Before we get into the substance of today's session, a little bit of background. One of the core missions of Columbia Engineering is to prepare engineers in service to humanity. And I am confident that the work that you do, both at Columbia and beyond Columbia, has the potential to do great good in the world. But I'm also confident that the work that you do at Columbia and beyond Columbia has the potential to cause great harm in the world. And one of the challenges that the Professional Development and Leadership program is hoping to have us collectively address is to give you a grounding in the understanding of the issues that affect engineers regarding ethics and other ways to understand right and wrong, and also to understand the requirements to behave with integrity in an academic setting while you are here at Columbia. Integrity is a word that I find fascinating because it has two apparently different meanings. The first meaning of integrity has to do with the behavior and the motivations of human beings. So it has to do with behaving with honesty, behaving with rectitude, behaving uprightly, behaving with honor. And that's a very important meaning of the word integrity. And when we think about ethics, we think about integrity in this regard. But as engineers, you will also know that the word integrity has a completely different meaning. And it has to do with structural unbrokenness, with structural wholeness. So for example, in the aftermath of an airplane crash, you might hear the investigators conclude that some force compromised the structural integrity of the airframe. Well, they're not talking about morality, they're not talking about honesty, they're not talking about uprightness, they're talking about something that caused something that was otherwise whole and unbroken to break and to disintegrate. I actually like that idea of integrity as well, and I think it's a very good metaphor for understanding the other meaning of integrity. And that is, when we come to the work that we do, we need to bring our unbroken whole selves to that work. And we shouldn't assume that we can behave with one set of standards outside of school or outside of work, and with a completely different set of standards in school or in work. We need to come together in the work that we do in an unbroken whole way with honesty and with honor and with rectitude. This video is the introductory video for the required course on ethics and integrity. In this video, we're going to lay some foundational principles for the course as a whole, some of which we will revisit when we're together in the classroom, and some of which we will not revisit, but we'll leave it here on the video, and it's important for you to understand those principles before you attend the in-person session. The course as a whole, both the video portion and the in-person portion, covers a number of topics. The first is an overview of ethics in general. What are ethics? How do we think about ethics, and how do we differentiate ethics from other ways to think about right and wrong? In particular, we're going to talk about the meaningful differences between ethics and the law and morality and etiquette or politeness or aesthetics, that which is pleasing. And what's interesting is very often when people say this is the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do, they are thinking about one of these categories of consideration of behavior and motivation. But if we are not clear about which one of these we are talking about, it's very easy to confuse people, or very easy for people to misunderstand. So we're going to differentiate what we mean when we talk about ethics compared to the law, compared to morality, compared to politeness, and compared to that which is pleasing or unpleasing. We will focus on ethics being those behaviors that we ultimately take as habits, as the first resort. And one of the ways to understand ethics in the oldest sense of the word is that ethics is that which we habitually do. And it's important to always behave appropriately, because as soon as we start behaving inappropriately, that becomes the new habit, that becomes the new normal, that becomes the new default. We will talk about understanding ethics as normative standards, as the standards that define what is normal, what is acceptable, what is essentially the expectation of you in this environment, whether we're talking about engineering ethics or academic ethics or ethics in general. Ethics are normative standards, or the standards that define what is normal. We will talk about why those normative standards matter, and one of the reasons they matter is because they apply not only to members of an organization, members of a particular group of people who are all doing the same kind of thing, but they also give people who are not members of that group, of that industry, of that sector, an understanding of what is expected when they interact with people who are governed by a code of ethics. We will talk about what happens when ethical standards come into conflict with each other, and often they do. And we'll talk about what happens when ethics comes into conflict with some other form of behavioral guideline, like the law, or morality, or politeness, or etiquette, or aesthetics. And we will finally focus on how you know where you will draw the line. And I am not certain precisely where you will find yourself with the need to draw the line, but I'm deeply confident that at some point in your career, whether as a student or as an engineer or as an applied scientist, you will face a circumstance where you're going to have to draw the line and say, I can't go beyond this line and continue to operate with integrity. And we will give you a path forward so that you can continue your professional development and your understanding of ethics and other ways to understand right and wrong beyond this course, beyond this program, and beyond Columbia University. Hopefully we are giving you a life skill and a career skill, and not just something to get you through the next year and a half, 2 years, or however long you're likely to be here. In this session, this video introduction, we're going to do a subset of that. And we're going to begin with an overview of ethics. We're going to move on to this differentiation between different kinds of right and wrong. We will look at ethics as habits and why that matters. We will look at ethics as normative standards and why that matters. We will move on to talk about ethics for engineers and applied scientists, and what some of the commonalities are. We'll look at the evolution of codes of ethics for engineers and applied scientists and in other professions throughout the 20th century. We will look at the particular challenges of ethics for engineers and applied scientists, and we'll close with a pretty deep dive into the ethical obligations of a member of the Columbia engineering community. And there is a set of standards that govern behavior at Columbia Engineering, and it's critically important that you know what they are and that you know how to apply them in your studies and in your work here at Columbia. It's a regrettable reality that every year some meaningful number of our students engage in academic dishonesty and academic misconduct, and a number of them are required to leave the school as a result of that. And we want to make sure that you understand what the expectations are of you and understand what the consequences are for academic misconduct. With that, let's begin by understanding ethics in general and then move to engineering ethics in particular. Ethics can best be understood as describing standards of behavior that determine what is normal. Standards of behavior that help us understand what is socially acceptable within any given group. Whether it's a community in a nation, whether it's a community in a neighborhood, whether it's a family, whether it is a school, ethics help members of a group understand what is socially acceptable across 4 different kinds of standard. The first is We understand those behaviors that are permitted, in other words, the things that we may do. We aren't required to do them, we're not forbidden from doing them, but what is it that we may do? Every code of ethics, whether it's of an industry or of other forms of organization, begins by understanding what is permissible behavior. What may we do? Another category is encouraged behavior. What should we do? Not what must we do, but what should we do? Of all the things we may do, what are the things we ought to do? The third category is the things that we must do. What are the required behaviors? And then the final category is, what are the forbidden behaviors? What must we not do? What may we not do? So that's normative standards. They help a group understand the behaviors that are permissible, what they may do, that are encouraged, what they should do, that are required, what they must do, and that are forbidden, what they may not do. But it's very easy to confuse these normative standards with other ways of describing right and wrong. One of the ways to differentiate ethics is that ethics is all about publicly observable behaviors. And the normative standards apply to members of the group and to people who might be interacting with members of the group. But there are other ways to understand right and wrong, and it's important that we differentiate what they are. So, ethics is about publicly observable behaviors, but it is often confused with morality. Morality is not about publicly observable behaviors. Morality is about the value systems that drive people to behave in certain ways, the motivations people have, the priorities people have in their lives. And the thing about morality is we really don't know what the motivations are in people's lives. We really don't know what the values are that they use to decide what to do. We can only guess. And one of the ways we guess is we listen to what people tell us is their motivation and tell us are their value systems. And sometimes they are telling us the truth as they understand it, but sometimes they are unaware of what their motives may be. Ethics is far less concerned with the motivation for behaviors than that the behaviors be the right behaviors. So for example, if there's a code of ethics that says you must tell the truth and you may not lie, it's a matter of indifference whether the person who tells the truth and doesn't lie does it out of a moral commitment to always tell the truth or out of fear of being caught in the lie and suffering the consequences of the lie. But the good news about ethics is behaviors tend to become habitual. So even if someone initially only tells the truth and refuses to lie because their motivation is one of fear, that they don't want to be kicked out of something, over time they forget what their motivation is and they find themselves habitually behaving honestly. Ethics is less concerned about the motivation than about the behavior. Morality is all about motivation and value systems. And when we talk about ethics, it's important to keep that distinction clear. The other thing that is easily confused with ethics is the law. And whereas ethics describes the normative standards of behavior within groups, the law describes what the government has said is a requirement or what is permissible or is forbidden. And they have the force of government to punish people who violate the law or to create sanctions in a civil way to reimburse people who have been harmed or wronged by some behavior or some event. One of the things we often hear when someone is accused of behaving unethically is, but it's perfectly legal. And that is a common defense against accusations of unethical behavior, but it is not a valid defense. Because although it may be perfectly legal, it may violate the normative standards. So here's an example of that. Under the law of the United States and of the states in the United States, it is generally not against the law for people to lie to one another. And if there's a code of ethics that says you must not lie, and someone is accused of lying, the argument, but it is legal to lie, doesn't actually help. Now, there are some exceptions to the law. It is not legal to lie to the FBI. It is not legal to lie in a court of law. It is not legal to lie in testimony in front of Congress. It is not legal to lie on a form where you declare that you are telling the truth. There are a number of circumstances that the law says make it illegal to lie. But except where expressly enumerated, most lies are perfectly legal. Not necessarily ethical, but perfectly legal. The other way that we sometimes talk about right and wrong is to talk about that which is polite. And one of the things we find is very often when someone is accused of behaving unethically, for example, not telling someone the truth, their argument back is, but I didn't want to insult them. I didn't want to be impolite. I didn't want to be rude. And that's a perfectly valid concern, but it isn't a substitute for ethical behavior, and there are consequences for unethical behavior even if the motivation was to not give offense. So we need to keep in mind the distinction between ethics, that which is the normative standard, and etiquette, that which is polite. There's one final category where people talk about right and wrong, and that is what we might call aesthetics, or that which is tasteful, or that which is pleasing, or the opposite, that which is not displeasing, that which is not unpleasant. And for example, very often people who might, for example, be really uncomfortable with confrontation allow unethical behavior to go unaddressed. And when they're asked why, they said, I didn't want to confront them. I'm really uncomfortable with making myself the subject of attention when somebody is doing wrong. And that's a perfectly valid human concern. But we need to keep in mind that ethical behavior sometimes requires us to do unpleasant things, sometimes requires us to do things that we don't like to do. And we need to keep very clear when we're talking about something is the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do. Is it because it's a normative standard, or because it is something that I find tasteful or distasteful, pleasing or displeasing? We might begin to trace these different ways of understanding right and wrong in a kind of Venn diagram. So for example, some things are perfectly ethical and have nothing to do with morality. Some things are perfectly moral and have nothing to do with ethics, but there are areas where ethics and morality overlap. Similarly, with the law, there are places where the law is silent on questions of morality and morality is silent on questions of the law, where the law is silent on question of ethics and ethics is silent on the questions of the law. And there are places where law and ethics overlap, and places where morality and law overlap, and places where morality and ethics overlap, and some places where the three overlap. Similarly, with etiquette and also with aesthetics, there are varying ways that these 5 ways to understand right and wrong might overlap. We need to be aware when we're talking about right and wrong, which of these are we talking about? And we also need to be aware that for any given thing, any given behavior, any given motivation, there's often an overlap between different ways of understanding right and wrong. In the physical course, when we're together in a classroom, we'll look at case studies where engineers are put in situations where they have to choose a course of action. And one of the things we find is very often these overlapping and sometimes conflicting requirements of ethics and aesthetic and morality and the law cause people to figure out, whatever I do, I'm going to violate something. So if I'm going to violate something, what is the less bad thing to violate? In other words, where do you draw the line? What do you know you won't go beyond? We'll look at case studies about that when we're together in person. Now let's begin to move forward. The word ethics in English comes to us from ancient Greek, and it became the title of a book attributed to Aristotle. Aristotle didn't actually write books. He spoke lectures, and his students took notes and wrote down what he said, and then those books were published and attributed to Aristotle, and 2 of his books have the title Ethics in part of the title. And in the books on ethics, Aristotle, as taken down by his students, describes ethics as those behaviors that become habitual. And the Greek word ethics initially meant habit. The Greek word ethics initially meant behaviors that are habitual, and it didn't have any component of right and wrong. It was just the things we do, the things we always do. And Aristotle's book, the Nicomachean Ethics, is a book that focuses on those habitual behaviors that lead to happiness. And what Aristotle was concerned with was figuring out what are the kinds of behaviors that, habitually performed over a lifetime, lead one to have a happy life. Over the centuries, the word ethics began to evolve, and it began to take on the meanings that we have today. But one of the ways to understand ethics is to understand a phrase by Aristotle, and that is, we are what we habitually do, and therefore we need to be really careful about those things that we habitually do. So from the Greek, we understand ethics as habits. And in the modern context, we understand ethics as the behaviors that are habitually practiced by individuals or by groups. And as groups begin to form and as groups begin to become coherent bodies, what we find is over time, they establish the behaviors that are the norm for that group, the behaviors that they want their members to practice habitually. They are called normative standards because they describe that which is normal. They describe the norms. And we need to understand ethics as normative standards. Now, as normative standards, they apply to members of that group. But they don't only have relevance to members of that group because they can show non-members who might have contact with that group or interact with that group or want to emulate that group, the behaviors that are expected within that group, and that can guide people in their interactions with that group. It was about the middle of the 19th century in North America and in Europe where professional organizations started to come together, taking over the work of the medieval guilds. But as the Industrial Revolution began to take full steam, not to speak upon, as the Industrial Revolution began to get big, organizations began to form to serve the members of different professions. And codes of ethics were not initially part of that, but they began to be incorporated into the work of these professional organizations in the early part of the 20th century. The first formal organizations of engineers was the American Society of Civil Engineers. It was founded in 1851, but it didn't have a code of ethics until 1914. Similarly, the American Society of Mechanical Engineers was founded in 1880, and it also didn't have a code of ethics until 1914. So what happened between the time that these professional societies were started and the need to have a code of ethics? And the answer is there were notorious structural failures where the engineers were seen to have done something that caused great harm, in this case, great loss of life. And as a result, pressure started being put on those engineering organizations to find ways to standardize appropriate engineering. In 1879, there was a bridge over the Tay River in Scotland. And it was an engineering marvel, and it allowed trains to go over this body of water near the ocean, where previously it would have taken a lot of time to go around to the north of Scotland. And one day in 1879, or actually one night in 1879, a train full of people was going across the bridge. It was very bad weather, the winds were very strong, and the bridge collapsed, and the entire train went into the water, and a lot of people died. And it became a scandal. And it became the subject of parliamentary inquiries in Britain. It almost brought down a government. And it became an emblem of engineering failure, that either it was lack of competence or lack of maintenance or lack of ability to foresee the actual stresses on the bridge when you combine the weight of the train and the vibrations of the train and the wind and the rain, that there was some meaningful failure of engineering, and that needed to be addressed. In North America, we saw an equivalent failure on the Quebec Bridge over the St. Lawrence River, where again, a lot of people died, and there was a lot of government concern about the consequences of that. And as a result, codes of ethics began to be standardized for engineering organizations. And as more and more engineering and applied science organizations have come into existence, they have recognized the need to establish normative standards of behavior for their own industry and for the members and other institutions and individuals who interact with their members. So at this point, most of the organizations that exist to serve people who are in the various professions of engineering and applied science in North America and around the world have established some normative standards of what is appropriate behavior, what is permitted, what is encouraged, what is required, and what is forbidden. There are some elements of each of these codes that are specific to the kind of engineering or the kind of science that the members of those organizations engage in, but there are some common elements to all of these codes. And among the common elements is the first responsibility of engineers is to assure the safety of the public and the health of the public. Another is either stated as a positive or as a negative, the need for accuracy, truthfulness, objectivity, impartiality, or the prohibition against dishonesty or lying or misrepresentation, but it has something to do with truthfulness as a common element of all of these codes. There are also common elements of these codes of ethics that require that the privacy of individuals be protected and that confidentiality be preserved on things that are deemed to be sensitive or proprietary or otherwise might give advantage to a competitor, that privacy and confidentiality are common elements of all of these codes. In the aftermath of those notorious structural failures, one of the things that most of these codes of ethics have required is that members of their organizations have a way to demonstrate their competence to do the things that they are engaged to do as engineers or as applied scientists. Some codes of ethics prohibit someone from engaging in certain kinds of behavior unless they have formal training in that field of study or in that field of endeavor. And there are some organizations that not only require formal study, but actually a credentialing process, an examination or a demonstration of competency independent of the education of the engineer or of the applied scientist. Increasingly, engineering and applied science organizations talk about the need for their members to work in ways that protect the environment or cause minimal harm to the environment. There's a need to avoid conflicts of interest where possible and to disclose conflicts of interest where they can't be avoided. And finally, what these codes have in common is the need for their members to continue to develop professionally and to not assume that just because they've become a member that they're done learning. That continued professional development is one of the requirements of many of these codes of ethics. With that, let's begin to shift our focus from the work of engineering to the work of being a member of the Columbia University community and a student at Columbia Engineering. Ethics or normative standards of behavior, they define what is normal, they define what is socially acceptable, and they define behaviors that are permitted, that are encouraged, that are required, and that are forbidden. Columbia University as a whole has a set of expectations, and Columbia Engineering in particular has a set of expectations that are more granular but not inconsistent with the university-wide requirements. So it's important as new members of the Columbia University community that you visit the Essential Policies section of the website for Columbia University as a whole. And there are a number of different categories of drug use and alcohol use and discrimination and things like that. And you ought to become very familiar with those, but you ought to learn very deeply the rules of conduct governing members of the Columbia community. In addition to the university-wide standards, there are specific standards for Columbia Engineering. And I encourage you to go to the Columbia Engineering Policy on Conduct and Discipline. And I encourage you to become deeply familiar with the requirements, the prohibitions in the Policy on Conduct and Discipline of Columbia University. And among the things that it says is, as in any community, principles of civility and reasoned interaction must be maintained, as well as methods for addressing academic behaviors. So there are standards and there is discipline if those standards are not met. One of the core values of the university is that students are expected to conduct themselves in an honest and civil and respectful manner in all aspects of their lives, whether on campus or off campus. Students who violate standards related to academic or behavioral misconduct interfere with their ability and the ability of others to take advantage of the full complement of university life and will be subject to dean's discipline. So it's important to visit the academic integrity site on the Columbia Engineering Policies page. And one of the things it says is that it is your responsibility as a student to understand what your particular instructors or professors' requirements are with respect to group work, with respect to the timing of work. Ask them if they haven't yet made clear, or if you are unclear about what the instructors or the professors describe as their requirements in their classroom and in the work that you do in their courses. It's particularly important to understand that taking credit for someone else's work is a significant violation of academic integrity, and plagiarism, as taking credit for someone else's work is often called, plagiarism will be treated severely. In an environment where it is so easy to copy and paste, it is important when you copy and paste someone else's work that you identify it and identify the source and not give someone the impression that you came up with that content on your own. So you need to understand how to properly cite the source of information that is not your own, and critical that you not hand in the work until you've learned a proper way to use references, and you can ask your professors for guidance to see what they consider the appropriate way to attribute people's work in the work that you do. There are other forms of academic dishonesty that are elaborated on in the academic integrity section. That includes helping other students violate academic integrity policies. It includes giving assistance to another student in an inappropriate way, giving them answers to tests or giving them materials that they don't otherwise have access to. It includes offering something of value to someone who is in a position to evaluate your work. It includes cheating, wrongfully using unauthorized materials. It includes inappropriate collaboration, which is why it's so important to get clarity from your professor what work is expected to be individualized work and what work is expected to be collaborative work. Dishonesty, falsification of materials, forgery, violation of published institutional policies relating to ethics and integrity, failing to safeguard your own work, giving or taking academic materials, and obtaining advanced knowledge of things you're not supposed to know in advance, like the questions on exams, are all violations of academic integrity. We've talked about plagiarism, sabotaging another person's work or a professor's work. It's also important to understand that there's a concept of self-plagiarism. Taking work you've done in one course and repurposing it in another course is not permitted in most cases. So be sure that you have clarity about the degree to which you can repurpose your own work from one place into another place. These are among the standards, and it's critically important that you, as a student at Columbia Engineering, understand the standards and understand how those standards apply to the work that you do. So that's our video introduction. A quick preview of what we're going to do in the in-person session. First, we're going to do a brief summary of what we've done in this video, but not a long one. We're now going to begin to shift the focus to your own discernment of ethical issues and your own processes of decision making when ethics and integrity are on the line. We will look at a number of case studies where people had to know where they draw the line and where you might have to know where to draw the line beyond which you will not go. We will talk about what happens when ethical standards conflict with each other. For example, the duty of confidentiality interferes with the duty of truthfulness, and how do you navigate where those duties conflict? And we will also talk about what happens when any one form of duty, like ethics, violates or is in conflict with another form of duty, like the law. It is our hope that from this video introduction and the in-person session and your own discernment, you will have a clearer understanding of what the issues around ethics and integrity are in engineering and in applied science, and that you will be able to deploy your gifts and to apply your learning in ways that contribute both to science and technology and engineering, but also contribute to the well-being of the human species and the human planet. Because a core value at Columbia Engineering is creating engineers in the service of humanity. If you find this introduction and our in-person required ethics introduction to be interesting to you, then I encourage you to enroll in the Advanced Ethics elective that I teach later in the semester and in the spring. I also teach crisis management for engineers, and in the spring we'll be teaching advanced communication skills for engineers who need to persuade people of things, for example, to get budget or to get headcount or to get a project approved or to get hired. And I look forward to seeing you in the classrooms this semester and in later semesters. With that, thank you very much.